Hi, and welcome to Out of the Lab, the podcast where we take people out of the lab and put them in front of the mic. I'm your host, Ruvoinov, and I am the only scientist to think that their views are not heard widely enough. As you may or may not know, I completed a dual master's degree between Johns Hopkins University in the US and Tsinghua University in China. A Swiss French-American native, I thought I was making an obvious choice when undertaking this program between the most highly ranked institutions in China and the US in my field, biomedical engineering. To my surprise, I was not only the only Western applicant selected for this program, but the first non-Chinese to come to China as part of it. My experience during these 2 years at Tsinghua taught me invaluable lessons on the place of science and academia more broadly in society, and opened my eyes to how similar people halfway across the globe truly are. Until the COVID-19 pandemic, the number of Western students studying in China had been increasing year over year as universities gained international recognition. During the pandemic, the number of Western students in China dropped significantly. For American students, this meant going from hundreds of thousands to mere hundreds. That said, as the country is opening back up, these numbers are starting to rise again. I believe it has never been more obvious that across the world, science is intimately tied to politics. Choices on which students are selected or permitted to obtain their education from which universities will impact how the next generation of scientists is formed. Decisions on which science is funded and which purposefully isn't will drastically shape which medicine, technologies, or infrastructures we will have access to. I don't want to get too deep into the weeds today on the potential shift elite institutions are undergoing right now. I think that's a whole other episode. What I want to focus on is the China case. Westerners are less prone to study in China than the other way around. One reason being China's limited soft power in our countries, combined with a strong competing Western rhetoric. But this is only one part of the puzzle. Today, I'm talking to two of my close friends, Susan and Thomas, who were also studying at Tsinghua while I was there. Together, we'll explore what it was like being a Western student in China's top university and why we think there aren't more of us. Guys, welcome to the show.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Hi, Lou. Thanks for having me. Excited to be on your show.
So happy that you're here. Thank you for coming on. Could you please introduce yourself and tell us what you were studying in Tsinghua?
Yeah, so my name is Susan St. Dennis, and I went to Tsinghua University to study Chinese politics and foreign policy. But it ended up being more of an international relations degree when it came to specific details about the Chinese political system. We did not touch that with a 10-foot pole. But yeah, this was my second master's. I got my first master's in Chinese studies, specializing in Chinese politics and film. And then my undergraduate degree was in journalism with a minor in Asian studies, concentrating in Chinese. So really the China field has followed me throughout my college education.
Right. So you're like a social scientist, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Folks, I told you I was open-minded.
There's no beakers, there's no tubes in my field. It's all thoughts and feelings.
We'll make do. We'll make do. No, I thought it would be extremely valuable to have Susan on to represent another side of academia and obviously with a brilliant mind. So thank you for coming on.
Yeah, my name is Thomas, and I am a second-year PhD student here at Tsinghua in the Department of Computer Science. To summarize, our lab does brain-inspired AI. So we take concepts from neuroscience and complex systems theory, and we apply it to engineer more efficient and more performant neural network architectures in AI.
Okay, we'll start with the classic question. Why did you choose to study and come to China?
Yeah, so I have been coming to China to study since I was 15, 16, I think was the first time. You know, my family has a long history in China. My dad taught law and business in China in the 90s. I grew up just hearing the stories about China. So when I went to high school, it was an obvious choice for me to study Chinese. I loved it. And after a year of studying the language, I got the opportunity to go to Qingdao, which is a coastal city in China, to study at a high school. And I was only there for like a month or so. But leaving was one of the most difficult things in my life. And I really promised myself that anything I did in my life was going to involve China. So going to Tsinghua, it was really because I wanted to get back to China as soon as possible. So I really just Googled China programs, and the Tsinghua one came up. And I said, well, brother, we're going. I don't think I did nearly enough research. I just was desperate to get back in the country because I knew if I was going to speak on China, if I was going to be a China expert. I
Mm-hmm.
absolutely needed more years under my belt. And yeah, I threw my application in, and the rest is history.
I'd say I have a little bit of maybe a different story of China than maybe most internationals here, because I grew up most of my life when I was younger in Hong Kong. So I went to a French school in Hong Kong. So I have kind of a link with China and relatively familiar, even though life in Hong Kong and in the mainland is quite different for an international. So I did my high school in Hong Kong, but then I studied in the UK, and then I went to work in Germany for a few years in the tech industry. And at the time, I wanted a new challenge. I wanted to get into research. I naturally looked at China because I knew they had very interesting research centers. To be honest, the main reason I came here was because the specific research center perfectly aligned with what I was interested in. And they were specifically quite open to pluridisciplinary students, because I myself didn't study computer science in my undergraduate. I studied economics. At the same time, I always wanted to come back to China. I had been continuing to learn Chinese by myself in Europe, and I just loved to travel. Let's say Tsinghua and China was like quite an obvious choice at that point.
You know, I studied Chinese a little bit in high school for around 4 years. And you know, Thomas, he grew up in Hong Kong. So I'm wondering, do you think, or have you seen around you that even a small prior of Chinese influence in our lives makes us a lot more keen or willing to go study there? Like even just a little bit, right? Me, it was what Chinese like classes, like language classes. But I think even that opened the door and made me less afraid of the experience. Would you agree?
I absolutely agree. And it's interesting because when it comes to the American students specifically that I
Mm,
meet in China that are studying, I have never met one who didn't have a background with China in some way, shape, or form.
right.
They at least had 1 year of Chinese language under their belt. And I think that's what led to them being more comfortable with going to the other side of the globe, which I think is a really important thing for, again, the American students specifically, why there are so few in China.
Let's say leaving aside maybe like ethnically Chinese that are living from Southeast Asia, who have like
Yeah,
an obvious
yeah.
connection with the culture and the language. People who don't have that like, family or history, definitely they all have this connection. As you said, like even a language course, a lot of people went to high school programs, even if it's like half a year or a year to China. And even sometimes a little bit random, maybe they worked in a Chinese company or they had like Chinese colleagues and they kind of knew more about the university. Actually, it's very, very rare to find people who have like complete no connection to China coming here. There are a few actually, and they're the real brave ones and the real trailblazers. But yeah, there's very few. I agree.
We will refer to ourselves as
Yeah.
foreigners as we were over there, right? So that's what they
Yeah.
called us. Were there a lot of foreigners in your program?
My program was specifically geared for foreigners, and I think this is a really unique difference between you and me when it comes to our experiences. My program was advertised to foreign students. It's completely taught in English, advertised as being entirely taught in English.
To give a bit of context, I was the only Westerner in my program. I was mainly doing research, but I was the only non-Chinese in my lab. So my lab meetings were in Chinese, although individually I got to speak English with my supervisor and with my colleagues. But it was definitely more of throwing me in a Chinese environment compared to Susan, who had this more curated program. But I think what's really interesting is through conversations we've had in the past, right? We find so much common ground, even with these differences in our program.
So PhD in computer science, I would say we are all years combined. We're probably, I would say 10 to 15 foreigners. I don't know the exact numbers, but I would imagine that's around like 10% of all PhDs in the computer science department. And most of them have gone through the master's program first. So very, very few go directly to a PhD program. The reason is that essentially when you do the master's here first, you get to know the professors, you get into a lab, and you have that first experience to know that that's really what you want to do, either with a professor, either as a PhD. So research-wise, my interaction is mostly with Chinese, just because my lab has mostly Chinese people, but we mostly interact in English.
And this is sort of repeating my question of before, but did you find any through-line characteristics from the foreigners that come to China? Aside from potential involvement with China in the past, whether that be with language or other.
I would say definitely, which seems obvious, but like just much more open-minded. We have lots of stereotypes in the West about how life in China is or how Chinese people are. And so anybody that's coming here and committing for a whole full program, which is minimum 2 years, but some like PhDs are 4 to 5 years or more, they're ready to like broaden the mind. Even myself, I've lived for a very long time in Hong Kong. I've been to China a lot of times. there was still a lot of culture shocks. So I would say that's why also a lot of foreigners, even though they have a connection with China, it's still quite courageous to come here full time.
We're so brave. Yeah, I know.
That is a really good question. For Americans specifically, yes,
Yeah.
I can absolutely speak on clear similarities. For the larger foreigner population, there's categories. There's clear groups that I would notice. So the group number one would be Chinese ethnicity students. This made up the majority of the foreigner students at Tsinghua. These were students who were from Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore. They would be fluent in Chinese, number one. They would know Tsinghua well. So
Yeah.
because they come from Chinese backgrounds, Tsinghua is a very big name.
Yeah.
And it is a big deal to be going to that school for them, even though they're outside of China because they're within Chinese circles. The other category of students would be the ones who were looking for an experience. So for these foreigner students, they were coming to China because it is this exotic other category. I
Yeah.
want something crazy on
Yeah.
my list of things that I've done.
They're
And so
traveling every weekend.
yeah, absolutely. And I mean, a lot of them still, took their studies seriously. I'm not trying to bash it, but really why they were there is not because of the prestige of Tsinghua or not because they had an interest in China per se, but more because I want to have this unique experience while I'm young where I get to do all these crazy things and have all these interesting stories and experiences. And then the final group, and I think I'll throw the Americans as a majority within this group. These are people that were interested in going into politics or diplomatic affairs, something along those lines. They have a background in China. They are specifically interested in China. They had a specific interest in their country and China and how they work together in their field.
Yeah. No, I totally agree, especially the first category. Like that's why I often say Westerners versus foreigners, or Westerners as a part of the foreigners, because if you are indeed from Malaysia or Indonesia or pretty much any Southeast Asian country, yeah, you're probably fluent in Mandarin and you grew up with Tsinghua being, or this goes for Beida or any big Chinese university, being their Harvard, their Stanford. It's extremely present, which it's not for us. Most people that I talk to don't know these universities at all. And these universities are extremely highly ranked. I mean, we can talk about rankings all day, but they are. So I think they're definitely approaching this from a different point of view, and their experiences are going to be extremely different from ours. That's why I want to focus on Westerners, because I can't really speak on how it was for them. And I think you're totally right with the categories.
In the third grouping, I would say I would like broaden it to like they understand like China's potential and they kind of want to be
Right.
part of it. So like whether
Right.
it's like in IR, they're interested in the links between China and the world, or it might be just be like in computer science and tech, like either
Yeah.
working with Chinese companies or being part of the Chinese AI revolution, or even those that still want to do business, but like maybe they link their country with China in terms of business. And I think they're pretty easy to differentiate. I mean, most of people coming here for the experience, as you said, they travel a lot. They're more like exchange students or here just for 1 year. The mindset is just very different. Also, like in terms of learning Chinese, which ones are
Yeah.
more committed to learning Chinese or integrating or understanding the country more, I would say.
In terms of studying in China or living in China, what do you think surprised you the most?
It's interesting because I had already studied in China before.
Yeah.
So I went to high school in China, and this gave me a really good foundation for understanding what academic life was like in China. Intense, intense. I think what surprised me the most, though, and what I ended up struggling with the most, and you'll relate to this, I think we've talked about this before, is the fact that I was not considered a real student. I really felt that way. So when I came to Tsinghua, I really came in with this mentality of I am a Tsinghua student.
Yeah.
I am amongst the elite who have gotten into this prestigious university. But when I arrived and when I started taking my classes, it very quickly became apparent that I was an entirely different category. And there was a difference in the way that I was treated as a student, not necessarily negatively. It's just this weird categorization where people were like, yeah, you go to Tsinghua, but did you really earn your place here? Because I didn't go through the Gaokao, which is the national examination that all Chinese students in high school take to get into college. It determines which university you get into. And it's a very, very difficult exam. I didn't go through that. I got into Tsinghua, it seems to people, solely because I am a foreigner and they need foreigners on campus.
Yeah.
No one was mean to me about it. It just was a felt vibe. And I could see a clear difference in the academic expectations between me and my Chinese classmates. And that's something that still to this day has really messed with me, I think, psychologically when it comes to confidence and understanding, really what did I accomplish?
I would say one thing that surprised me a lot, this is not really about studying and more about like Chinese people, is the generational gap. In the sense of like how traditional the parents are and how open-minded the young people are. I've heard so many times young people in Beijing, which is of course is a specific part of the society because they're mostly quite educated in the capital, but still like they really don't think as that differently from how we think like in, let's say, Western countries. But what's different is the pressure or how differently they have to fight against their parents about actually a lot of things, about like career choices, relationships. So actually that's what surprised me a lot, how different it is. But actually in a good way, because actually I could connect much more to like younger local Chinese, much more than I expected actually.
As Westerner students, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. We're given special treatment.
Yeah.
That's just the fact of the matter. I had an entire class switch from Chinese to English for a semester because I had to be in that class because I needed that credit. They switched the class from Chinese to English when Chinese students were counting on that class and taking that class. We are very fortunate in that sense, and you can try to forget about it, but I can understand that it's a very frustrating thing.
Because it is so blatantly unequal. I think that's really what it is, for example, you and I were in the same dorm. And I think this is the best way to really explain it to people is the foreigners get their own dorms. And our dorms are nice.
They're nice.
They are schwanky. But then you had this Chinese students' dorms, which is a whole other step down.
It's
It's not. It's like run down, stuff isn't working. It really is like a completely different thing. From the first dorm that I was in, we had our own cleaning service. We had cleaning ladies, like a hotel, which is crazy.
So some of the Chinese dorms, their bathroom stalls don't have doors.
Oh, yeah.
No door.
None.
No.
It's just kind of an accepted reality. In some situations, there would be this animosity. It was never directed at Westerners, and that's a whole other interesting category of the section of foreigners, the difference between students from the West, students from the Middle East, students from Africa, and the way that they were treated. For the Westerner students, there was not animosity, or I would never hear, it was just kind of an accepted reality.
So I always, whenever people like especially Chinese people, they tell me like, oh, you're so lucky, you're a foreigner, you have so many privileges. When I answer to that, it really depends what kind of privileges you want. Like if you want like ego boost and people looking at you and wanting to be your friend directly and taking photos of you and following on social media, sure, I will definitely have this privilege. And okay, it's kind of nice, but it's a very short-term like shadow thing. Then the privilege I would say we don't have is really integrating into Chinese society. Part is a language, or part is just the fact that we're like not ethnically Chinese, so we'll never be completely accepted. So that accounts identity-wise, of course, but more also about the job market. Whenever you would get in a Chinese company, there would always be people telling you, oh, you're just here because you're a foreigner, for example. So I've had friends like that who've been in companies and they're just normal workers like everybody else and they speak good Chinese. They're still like saying these kind of comments. So I would say like integrating it into like maybe more normal Chinese life, especially around the job market, is much harder. At university, I would say you definitely have a bit of privilege because they are encouraging foreigners to come. Stipends in general are slightly more generous to foreigners. They're just from different funding routes. So they're they're not like equivalent. It's not like foreigners get this and locals get this. There's different funding routes, but still, you still get mostly a better deal. For example, you share your dorms with one person instead of four. These kind of small things.
I know we've been talking about how our privilege is, but what do you think was pretty tough for you on a very practical level going to China?
Yeah. So I think you actually mentioned this on an aside when you were kind of sharing your experience with your program, is you talked about how, they hadn't really planned the program for me. You came in and then the classes were all in Chinese and it's like, oh, surprise. I am not fluent. To this day, a bunch of the instructions are entirely in Mandarin. And you have to remember for like my program, you don't have to speak Chinese. It is
Me
advertised
neither.
entirely taught in English. And yet we don't get any of our paperwork in English. Most of the people in the leadership positions, official positions, don't speak English. So, for example, we had a situation where my scholarship wasn't coming through, and this was affecting everyone in my program. For 4 months, none of us got our scholarship. We're trying to figure out how to fix this. No one in the department handling scholarship affairs spoke English. I understand that I'm in a different country. I understand I'm in China. I'm not expecting people to accommodate, English. But if you advertise the program as being in English, if you're advertising it to foreigner students where you do not need to speak a single word of Chinese,
Yeah.
you have a responsibility to maintain that,
Yeah.
because now you get into all of these issues with like safety and people knowing what they have to do, because now you're having students where, because there's no language accommodation, what happens when they need to report stuff to the police? What happens when there's issues with visa paperwork? And you would really have to drag your Chinese friends around with you, which was a whole other, like, that always made me feel really guilty, where it's like, I
Yeah.
promise I'm friends with you for more than just your ability to translate. Like, any issue that I had would come back to this core problem of really the programs had not been entirely fleshed out in terms of dealing with foreigner students. And there wasn't a lot of language accommodation. So a lot of people were left in the dark, kind of
Yeah.
floundering around.
I know that was the case for me. And it's unfortunate because then a lot of Chinese students had to help me pick up the slack. I remember once they told me I had to take this class in Mandarin in order to graduate, which they knew I didn't speak Chinese coming in.
Right.
And one of the solutions offered to me was, what if you had a classmate translate the class for you for a whole semester? They would
Yeah.
translate the entire class. And I mean, they were thinking off the dome, but I cannot fathom this being an actual solution. And I said, there's no way I'm making somebody do this for me. But yeah, it was really tough. And I was constantly bothering my Chinese classmates and friends to help me out.
It's kind of cultural, but it's also like how you, let's say, deal with the administration, deal with people in the service industry, or how you interact with all these people. Like, so for example, like when you speak like to customer representatives, they're actually super helpful, super fast. But on the other side, for example, administration and, let's say, more official things are much more rigid and strict, and there's a lot of rules you don't understand and don't know that you expected to know. That's a little bit like harder sometimes to figure out. Here, it's actually a really big mix of like formal and informal. There's very formal rules that are strict, and there's lots of informal ways to, let's say, call a government service and ask them for questions. They might be super helpful and actually tell you a different way to do things, which isn't written anywhere, for example. And this you only figure out with time.
Do you think the other foreigners in your program had the same experience as you?
I think a lot of the people in my program were very jaded by the end. It was interesting how quickly people stopped taking it seriously. This wasn't across the board for everyone, but it was something I noticed, where people came into the program really like bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, ready to give it their all. And then the moment it became apparent that they weren't held to these standards and that there was really no one really cared what they did, suddenly it was like, yeah, I'm just going to turn in ChatGPT papers for everything. I'm not going to participate in class. For many of us, we came in with this goal of wanting to understand China, study China, and then we're never able to do that because it was almost like they didn't want us to learn. Like they would take us to like these events, for example, where they would, take us around China to different cities and do these tours to learn about things like rural revitalization in China, or like development across the country. But then it wouldn't be translated. And it would be like, oh, ask your Chinese classmate to translate for you. Well, like, just like you said, that's an incredible burden. Now I'm taking away from their experience. And none of them want to do that because they're also not professional translators.
I guess the big difference as a foreigner is like whether you can speak some Chinese or not. And the problem is that I would say the bar to make your Chinese useful in these situations is quite high. Say one of my frustrations at the start is like I thought I had a pretty good Chinese level, and it was still I would still not be understood by some people, like a single word. Like sometimes people wouldn't even understand my numbers because I wasn't doing the tones right. That would be quite hard, because especially if you put in a lot of effort before to learn Chinese, and then you come here and you expect to like just dandy around and speak everybody's in Chinese. It's not that easy.
What do you think China could, or let's say Tsinghua, because that was our experience, right? What do you think Tsinghua could do to make our programs more, or the university more accessible to foreigners?
You need to have a foreigner in the department. Because what they have are the Chinese students or it's Chinese professors, or for the people who are working that aren't even professors or students, these employees, they only know the system in China. Very rarely would they have any experience outside of China. So they would have no concept of the difference other than it's a different country you're coming from. It's like, no,
Yeah.
it's an entirely different academic system. It's an entirely different set of expectations. And so they couldn't understand the problems that we were having. And so to them, it was just, how are you not getting this? This is obvious. You know, for example, if you're needing to get certain things like for paperwork signed, in China, it's just a given that you have to get all of these stamps and go to all of these places, yada, yada, yada. That's not a
No
given.
idea. No, we have
No
no
clue.
idea.
We
Zero.
don't know who to talk to. We don't know how to make these calls. It's a different culture. It was basically anytime we had a problem, we would go to people to tell them this problem. They would go, well, obviously you do this. And it's
Did
like,
you
well, no,
read
it's not
the
obvious.
email? Yeah. You're
Like, are you idiot? Are you slow? And it's like, no.
Once somebody asked me, like, do you not understand? I was like, no.
I got explicitly asked if I had a learning disability. I'm so
When you're
serious
so
because
bad at paperwork that people ask if you have a learning disability.
they're like, so something wrong with you? And it's like, no,
No, I swear.
y'all are crazy.
So there's two things. I think one is just being more known abroad. As you said, most people that know about the program or like the computer science program, because they've had a link with China. So they know about the Tsinghua University, they know about the program. Being more well known in other universities, whether it's for exchanges, double degrees, or that kind of stuff, is very important, because when people realize the lifestyle you have here, the research opportunities you have, the stipends you might get, actually it's a very, very good life for early career researcher or even just a master's student who's interested in research. I mean, to give you an example, like every single master's student in computer science has to have a lab which pays them. So at least for the second years, they're all more like very encouraged to publish. Like we've got even like undergrad students, like foreign or local, that start researching already. And personally, now that I'm here, one thing that I would appreciate more is, and that's more like a systemic thing, is about giving you more opportunities to integrate like the Chinese job market. Because as a foreigner, it's still quite hard. First, there's the language. There's again all these guanxi, but there's also like internships. Like technically, we're allowed to do internships, but it's quite restricted about when, where. And nobody really advertises anything. Nobody comes to university to present their company. At least for us, like foreigners. If you think of all the innovative big tech companies that are in China, there's so many opportunities. I mean, all the local Tsinghua computer science graduates go to incredible companies and have very interesting jobs. And if actually foreigners knew that, or were given more opportunities, I think that would convince a lot of foreigners to come here.
Yeah, so just guanxi is the Chinese word for connection or relationship.
Yes.
I think you are in a special case because you are working with the only professor, I think, in the computer science department who is not Chinese, right?
Yes.
So how different has that experience been?
I think honestly, it makes my let's say experience at university much better, because I don't feel like I'm alone. Like my professor feels as lost sometimes with the processes and how to do things. So I would say actually it's helped me a lot, also because I think that I understand a little bit China and Chinese culture a little bit better than him. So sometimes I'm able to like help him not really like with the actual process, but more like give him advice on how to deal with certain things. And I think it's still very interesting actually to see one of the very few foreign professors who has full professorship here navigating having a lab here. So paying students and finding funding either from companies or from the university or from the NSFC, the National Science Foundation of China. I think it's quite interesting to see how a foreigner here is able or not to sustain a lab. Which at the moment he is, but it's definitely not easy. Just to give you an example, we actually have to hire a full-time assistant in our lab to help with all the administration, whether it's for him and then it's for funding, for grants. It's not his assistant is writing the grants. They're just helping with the actual process.
Why do you think there aren't as many Westerners in China as the other way around? I think it's many things. The soft power is a huge thing. And also the fact that China is less ready administratively to welcome foreigner students. Curious to hear your thoughts on that.
I think the big thing really is that people do not know how good Chinese institutions are. So for Tsinghua, for example, It's one of the leading universities in the world
Yeah.
when it comes to science and technology.
Yeah.
Anytime, we told people in the US that I was going to Tsinghua, they were like, "What? Is
No
that like a
clue.
community college?" And it's like, "No, it's the Harvard of Asia, folks." But like no one knows this. Tsinghua University would make LinkedIn posts, get maybe like
Yes.
10 likes. Would not know how to use LinkedIn. Even the Instagram that Tsinghua has isn't run by Tsinghua University. It's run by foreigner students. It's a club. I don't know how official the Tsinghua University Instagram page actually is, because what I do
Right.
know, it was girls in our dorm, these freshman girls that were running a whole social media team. And that is like really Tsinghua's outlet to the world, is this Instagram page. And then also in general, I think in the West, Chinese institutions aren't respected as legitimate academic spaces. There's this idea that you go to these universities and there's no ability to get a true education or learn or anything because everything's censored and repressed, which is also huge inaccuracies in that
Yes.
idea. I don't know what you do to change that. I think this is part of it, where it just has to be foreigner students who went there leaving and then them gaining notoriety in some way or talking openly about their experiences. I think that's really the best way to improve the standing of these schools internationally outside of Chinese circles.
I mean, what the very obvious one is just like what people think of China and like negative stereotypes they have of China. Linked to that bias is they don't imagine that life in a Chinese university is as good as life in a European university or in a European city. People realize when they come here, life is more comfortable and more modern than the majority of Europe, actually. And the university itself, for certain things, not everything, but for certain things, is much more modern or much more encouraging towards students. It's not just they don't agree with China or Chinese policy. It's more like, oh, why would we leave something that's less good than what we have?
But also guaranteed housing by the university, cheap housing, very cheap and reliable and fast public transport, stipends that are guaranteed, things like that also.
Agree. Yeah, you have your quality of life is just as good in Europe. That's the thing. Like if you look at the cash amounts and you compare to Europe, okay, it might not be that high. But actually, if you think of like your actual quality of life and what you're living here, it's actually just as good or better.
I've been questioned very strongly about going to live in China even, because it's very authoritarian. So how would you qualify your experience just living in China?
So here's the thing. As long as you're not making a whole big thing about Taiwan, Xinjiang, Tibet. So that's like big three things. And the thing is with those three, we would talk about it amongst ourselves and like have discussions about these issues. But as long as you're not going on in the public and yelling about that, no drugs. So as long as you're not doing drugs and then not breaching visa rules, as long as this is done, you would have no clue.
Yeah.
You wouldn't know that you're in an authoritarian system.
Yeah.
I think the first thing people notice is like all the cameras. And I think that being in a security state where you're constantly watched, that takes a second for people to get used to. But eventually it just becomes like you don't think anything of it. When we're using WeChat and these social media platforms, for foreigners at least, again, you're not held to the same standard as Chinese people. So you can do a lot more and get away with a lot more in terms of what you say and do.
Yeah.
For me personally, as an individual, I never dealt with a situation where someone was like, you can't say that, do that, write this, post this. It did happen to people I know where they ran into the censorship issue when it came to the research that they were doing. But even then, they were talking about an already very sensitive subject that had to do with Chinese history and was already like a tense subject in that department. That being said, though, self-censorship is totally a thing, 100%. And that's what's weird, is because there is this understanding of China's authoritarian, and then there's things you can't say or can't do, and there's no clear rules. That creates this thing where you have no idea exactly what you can or cannot say.
That's like maybe the first topic people want to talk about when we say we live in China. And like keep in mind that actually we live in Beijing, or used to live in Beijing, which is technically supposed to be the most controlled and strict city just because of the capital. There's just like specific topics or specific red lines that you're not supposed to cross, and that's about it. The more public facing things there is, the more sensitive topics can get. And so you go from like social media posting something completely public on Red Note, for example, which is like the Chinese Instagram, to messaging people on a WeChat group, to messaging your friend on a private WeChat message, to talking to your friend in a coffee shop, than talking to a friend at home. I was like, these are the different levels, and actually, the more you go down, the more it's acceptable to talk about more sensitive things.
Yeah.
And actually, this is not just with foreigners, but like even Chinese people know that, and it's just a modus vivendi that you have, where you just know when and where to speak of things.
Like continuing in this expectations people have about China, what do you think is something that people would not expect or may not know about living in China or studying in China?
So I think I want to go back to the censorship and free thinking
Yeah.
thing with your question, because I think the viewpoint people have outside of China is that in China there is no free thinking, there is no debate, and that the academic space is like this dead zone. And that's simply not the case, because I do think in China education is highly, highly valued. It comes off as though there is no debate in China, or there is no like rich academic discussion. And what you find is that it just happens in different areas. It happens in different spaces. There is a control in terms of what is projected, but there is a recognition of different perspectives, and that does happen. And you're able to go, no, I think this is wrong.
What do you think was the most valuable thing for you about studying in China?
Well, I think for me, what was so important was that it was eye-opening. And I think that's why I wanted to study in China for those 2 years, is I knew I need to understand China in depth, and I need to be able to communicate, and I need to understand how China is trying to communicate to others. So for those 2 years that I was there, it just opened my eyes to what China really is, and how Chinese people are, and again, what China wants the world to know about itself. Because I think everyone takes the way China presents itself globally, everyone takes it with this huge grain of salt, because state media, anything that's coming from state-controlled media must therefore be a lie, and it's entirely propaganda and is entirely false in nature. When in reality, there's things that are not talked about. Absolutely, where there's issues in China, problems in China that are not projected to the global viewing audience. But when it comes to what China says about itself, it is genuinely believed. Even when you would talk to Chinese people, when it comes to a lot of these things about how China presents itself as, the safety in China, the way that China has developed, the way that it supports people, lifting people out of poverty, all of these things, it is believed in China. When you talk to Chinese people, they talk about these problems. Many times there is a very positive view of the government as well. But that's difficult because it goes so much against what we're taught growing up outside of China, and what we see in the media and how we see other people talk about China is because what's concentrated on is, for example, authoritarianism. And that is in turn kind of exaggerated to this point of you go to China and you're going to be oppressed and it's going to be scary and there's these monsters that'll be after you and da 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 da. You're watched at all times, when it's not like that at all. And the last thing I'll say on this is part of why that's also a big problem is when it comes to the real issues in China. When people go to China for the first time, having grown up hearing all these awful things about the country, they go to China and they have an incredible time, and it doesn't feel oppressive and it doesn't feel like bad things are happening. It feels like everything's great. Now we have lost the ability to even talk about the issues that do occur in China,
Yeah,
because now it's such a dramatic difference. Therefore, everything is falling out.
it's so impossible as a Westerner to have it seems impossible to have a nuanced conversation about this country, because once you break free from that mold that you've been taught your whole life, right? Or that you're
Mhm.
still learning now, it feels very liberating. Like going to China, seeing all that it has to offer, it
Mhm.
feels, first of all, that you've overcome this lie and these teachings. So you feel like you are the smartest person in the world and you know the truth. And then it's very easy to get a bit too carried away and then go too far as to think that there are still no criticisms to be had. This is a country.
Mhm.
And this is an authoritarian country, whether you feel it there or not, as a Westerner, as a foreigner. And the second we lose the ability to have a nuanced discussion about any country is when these discussions are not worth having at all. Because now we're just
Yeah.
blowing air in opposite directions.
And it's
Right.
funny because even in China, this is a well understood thing as well, which is what I find interesting is for the foreigners that I would meet that were living in China, they had, no longer were going to school, they were just living. And I could see the difference for the foreigners who were diehard China fans. Were like, this is the perfect utopia. The way that they were treated by Chinese people with this kind of, you can see it happening where they are treated with kind of this, this guy. Like, they don't have the respect that they think they have, because in China, it's well understood that, here are all of these things I'm proud of in my country, and here are all of these problems. And this is a well understood thing of
Yeah.
balancing this and the way people talk about it. And you have to read between the lines with a lot of things. That's the truth of it. If you go on these extreme binaries, you miss
Yeah.
the point, and you're not actually
Yeah.
connecting with people, and you haven't actually come to understand the reality of the place you're at.
Mm.
I see it with myself. Like, I think I have like a very contradicting speech. Whenever I meet somebody who's very anti-China, I defend China a lot. And then whenever somebody's
Yeah.
like too pro-China, I am going against it. So I think it kind of depends who I'm talking to. I mean, it's not a perfect society, and people are stressed, and mental health isn't great, and there's still pressure and all the things. And also,
Mm.
we see a very biased view of China by being in
Yeah.
Beijing, by being in
Absolutely. And being
Tsinghua,
a foreigner.
and being a foreigner. Like, you get to meet like more or less the most educated and more or less privileged people in China,
Yeah.
actually. These are like the people who've benefited a lot from the system. So of course you're gonna, like, from our point of view, it seems like, oh, this is a great system.
I think you and I would agree that we would have our experience again 1,000 times, right?
Oh, yeah.
Would you recommend this to other people?
You need to know what you're doing when you go to study in China. That's my big thing. I think a lot of the people I know, they went and studied in China, and it negatively impacted them career-wise.
Yeah.
I had one person in my life who, they went and studied in China. They went back and tried to get a job in the State Department. Couldn't get the job because they had been associated with people who were linked with the Communist Party, and it's this whole thing, which is inevitable.
Inevitable. Everybody, like 80% of Tsinghua students are in the CCP, by the way. It's not a big deal in
And
China.
Tsinghua is
It's
one of the
like,
political schools, so it's, a lot of the
yeah.
people there are studying to go into the government, and you quickly realize, one, that doesn't mean they're not this scary big bad person.
Yeah.
No, they're just a regular dude who's, wanting to be involved in our government or wants to go in the military. It's no different
No different.
mentally in terms
Yeah.
of the motivations, really, than it is in the US, honestly. And then I knew people that weren't able to get a PhD because of it, because Tsinghua and Chinese universities in general are not respected in the US. While it's understood that Chinese students will come from those schools, if you are an American or anyone really who's not Chinese, and you study at those schools and you try to apply, you can't register Tsinghua. It's not a listed school. You have to put it as another category. And then because you're linked with China, well, people don't take that degree seriously. So it's like, listen, if you're wanting to go, I really only recommend it for people that are wanting to go in a field involving China. If you want to do Chinese language, or if you're interested in US-China relations, or your country and China relations, or you're wanting to work in China, then you should do it. But at the moment, I don't think the system in China is ready for students who studied in China. I don't think nearly enough are open and honest about their experience to
Yeah.
where people can really understand what they're getting into when they go. I think a lot of people just concentrate on all of the cool travels that they do, which is true. You and I did all kinds of fun trips together.
Yeah.
But the academic part is no joke. And if you're going and you're really wanting to study, and you're really wanting to do well academically in China, mentally, it's a big toll. And I think people need to really make sure that they are ready to take on that kind of a challenge.
It's a tough issue because it was very transformative for me.
Mm.
And thus, instinctively, I would want other people to have the same experience. And I'm going to push back slightly because at least the feedback that I've gotten from scientists is that they're quite impressed. But I agree that maybe that would have been less the case if I had just randomly gone to Tsinghua without having gone to Hopkins first. I'm not sure. And it's true, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And that's sort of how we come out of it, looking back. I think the most important point here is going back to what you said. It's great to go if you are extremely clear on what this program is going to offer you and what it can't.
Absolutely. I think it is, like you said, it is a transformative experience because it's just eye-opening, and you meet so many cool people and have all of these interesting perspectives. But part of the transformation is because of how challenging it can be, where you're
Yeah.
really put into testing positions that you wouldn't be ever put in otherwise. And you learn a lot about yourself as a result. I want to make sure that for other people that are going in, that they know that that's something that's going to take place.
Actually, I can 100% empathize with everything you said. Like on one side, I want to tell them it's great and I want to tell them to come. So I don't want to say anything negative because
Yeah.
as you said, there's like already enough negative things. Whenever I speak about my experience, I try to be careful about that. But in the end, it's true that like warning them of like certain of these big challenges is kind of important because it does impact them a lot. I think, yeah, it's just being a bit balanced.
Yeah, at least for me, since I was the first foreigner to come to Tsinghua as part of my program,
Mhm.
I didn't have a single person to tell me what it was going to look like. To me, it was a black box. To tell you how bad it was, people were telling me about how the pollution was going to be so bad in Beijing that it was good that I didn't smoke during my life because I'm going to be going to Beijing, so I'll be like catching up on my
Yeah.
years of non-smoking there. And the air quality in Beijing is as good as in Berlin. And the fact that I did not know that, I mean, I could have searched it up, I guess, and I would consider myself a pretty educated person, but this was a stereotype, which was true, of course, in Beijing 10 years ago, and is still
Mhm.
very much true in the areas where these factories were relocated, let's be honest. But in Beijing, this is not the case. And the gap of knowledge on what China is versus what idea we have in our mind of it, if we have an idea at all, is just so
Mm.
crazy that honestly,
Yeah.
any discussion on our behalf, I think, as long as it's a bit balanced,
Yeah.
is worth having.
I think I would recommend Prime because, especially for people who want to do research, it's very welcoming to research. They really give you the freedom and the encouragement and okay, a little bit of pressure, that's true. But let's say the right amount of pressure. If people want to like explore research, I think my program is great. And linked to that, like you have like, incredible professors here who have either founded like big companies or like worked with huge companies here, or are just like one of the best researchers in their field here. And the lifestyle after the 3 months of getting to used to China is very enjoyable and very comfortable.
To me, a really big part of my experience in China was the relationships that I built with Chinese people there, not just international students, and staying in my own bubble. I thought it was really important for me to make connections with people outside of that. So I know you were on the rowing team. I was on the Tsinghua soccer team, and I made a lot of my friends through there. And they're the ones who reached out and invited me to join the team. And those were some of the best times I had. And the warmth and generosity of the Chinese students and the Chinese people in general is something that also is not mentioned. I think also because when Chinese students go abroad, they're very shy. People are like, "Oh, you're in your own bubble." International students in China are also in their own bubble. Let's not be crazy.
I think that's one of the biggest things I will say about studying abroad in China is the importance of integrating. And, you mentioned how international students are in a bubble when they go to China as well. This is normal. It is so hard studying abroad, no matter which way you're doing
Yeah.
it, because you're thrust in an entirely different culture. And the key to overcoming that is not just finding your little bubble of people from the same culture and community, but it's also integrating and forcing yourself into, for example, campus life at this new university you're at. So I did the rowing team, and it was just an incredible bonding experience where I, one, came to understand like the interests, the passions, the viewpoints of all of my Chinese peers. Sports are great because you have to work together to win competitions, and you're having to create plans and make sacrifices and do all of these things. It's building community, and that helps you overcome so many things. Like you said, you wouldn't know that from the way people talk about China. There's this idea that people there like, I don't know, dull.
Yeah.
These people talk about
Yeah.
like, oh, everyone tries brainwashed and all this stuff. And it's like, absolutely not. You have such an incredibly diverse population, all of these interesting, cool people to meet and get to know. And that was the best part of my time, is just getting to know people and understand people. It was incredible.
Being like in a Chinese community, I think that's the
So
most
true
fun part
integration.
because yeah, like true integration. They're still like treat me as anybody else, and like I don't get any special privileges or like get anything special. Like we're just like all friends doing the same thing and enjoying our time, and like we travel to competitions. And I think that's the most fun because like you really feel like kind of part of the country and part of China in that sense, which you probably don't feel very much in other places, like in other activities or in other walks of life here in China. Actually, China is, for certain things, are much more welcoming to foreigners than like majority of other countries. And actually, I totally agree. When you have tourists coming to like France or Switzerland, depending on where they are, how many they are, people complain. Like
100%.
here, nobody complains. People are so happy to have you here. They really want to show you. They're very proud of their country.
On that joyous note,
Yeah.
thank you so much for your time today, for your perspective. So precious as usual. Where can people find you?
Yeah, so I make videos teaching people about China. I've been doing that for like 5 years now, which is crazy. I analyze Chinese politics, history, news, whatever. If you have a question about China, I love answering it. So you can find me on TikTok at Dear China, or you can look up, Seaweed82 I think is the official username, which I cannot change.
That's embarrassing. Yeah.
But Dear China is the actual handle. So if you want to learn more about China, and if you have any questions about, studying abroad in China, if you want to maybe consider that direction, feel free to send me a message. I love helping people out with this stuff and talking to them about it. I will gladly share my experience with you.
My LinkedIn is just Thomas Adler. And also, if you want to follow the association that Lou and I co-founded, which is the Swiss Students in China Association, which I guess also Lou can link somewhere. These are like the two best things, and we both have LinkedIn pages for that. And then there's also my personal website, which you can see on my LinkedIn, where you can see some of my research interests.
And yeah, if people have any questions about my Chinese experience, also you can write to the podcast email, which should be in the description. All right. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lou. Bye.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Out of the Lab. If you enjoy the show, feel free to give a rating or leave a comment. You can find more about upcoming episodes on the show's social media accounts on Instagram and Bluesky. Everything is linked down below. See you next time. Bye.